All right. Well, hey there, this is Perch, and I'm here with Joe Corallo. How you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm doing better because I think we're hitting some comics that we both love.
Yes, before there was, X-Men,
Yeah,
and before, Team Comics really took off, there was this, little group called Legion of Superheroes.
that's right. The Legion of Superheroes, which has, I mean, in terms of like certainly for the volume of characters it introduced and the amount of creators that worked on, just the sheer kind of world building. I don't think there's anything else that comes remotely close to what Legion has done.
No, and unfortunately, because of the constant DC reboots,
Yeah.
it has sort of been pushed to the wayside, and we have like a whole generation, or possibly like two whole generations of comic readers who are either unaware of the Legion or like vaguely aware, or feel that it's like some sort of like impenetrable tome.
Yeah.
And you, as an X-Men fan, and me also being an X-Men fan, I think we can tell the audience here right now, the Legion, as much as people make jokes and as much as people talk about like, oh, there's no way anyone can comprehend the Legion, it's not really any more incomprehensible than like X-Men continuity.
No, I think it's easier. I think the big stumbling block you hit on is that we've had multiple kind of reboots through these continuity shifts, but that's kind of the confusing part. Once you wrap your head around that the team dynamic changed and they did things like write Superboy out of the picture for a while and that kind of stuff. That's I think it's easier to understand and comprehend than X-Men. X-Men had some weird spin-offs and other things going on. I think Legion is pretty straightforward, all things considered.
Yeah, and eventually at some point X-Men basically had about as much time travel as Legion.
Oh, for sure. And they also did their fair share of kind of character shenanigans and people changing here or there and all the rest. But Legion of Superheroes, it's been, let's see, we're going on 70 years. Is that right? Because it was the late 50s.
It was late 50s. It was 1958. It was Adventure Comics 247. And part of what's interesting about this is it was created by Otto Binder and or Otto Binder. I don't know exactly how you pronounce his name. And Al Plastino.
Yes.
And Al Plastino and Otto, they were like regulars on like the Superman books.
Yes.
And Otto around then, I think, was the regular writer of all like the Supergirl adventures.
Mm-hmm.
So they created this like very much one-off story.
Yeah, wasn't going to go anywhere really, well, they didn't know, right?
They not only didn't know, they had no plans, because it was almost 2 years later in Adventure Comics. What was it, 267, when they appear again?
Right.
Because and that was a lot of people just writing in, being like, "Where's the Legion? Where's Poochie?
Yeah.
When Poochie's not on the screen, everyone should be asking, where's Poochie?"
Exactly. No, it was the characters caught the attention of people kind of right away, and I think part of it was, at least to some extent, the simplicity of it. It was this view of the future. It was relatively straightforward. It had a kind of a retro future kind of vibe to it, and yeah, I mean, fan support almost immediately was strong. People writing in, wanting to know where these characters would go, and then I think through, not to get ahead of ourselves, but through the early 60s, that team got incredibly popular, as I recall.
Yeah, and that's in part because of you had Edmund Hamilton and Jerry Siegel writing most of those stories, with John Forte and Kurt Swan
Yeah.
doing most of the illustrations. You also had like Jim Mooney, George Papp, working on some stories, which is interesting, and I think a lot of people that aren't familiar, especially with like some of these like Silver Age DC titles and things like that, like a lot of modern comics understanding is that if you created characters, you were probably working with them for a while.
Yeah.
Otto and Al barely worked with the Legion.
Right.
They did that one story. They occasionally did like a handful of other stories. I think Otto wrote all the like handful of appearances in when they interacted with Supergirl and a couple of other things. But it was almost entirely Edmund Hamilton and Jerry Siegel who would sort of move the team forward, and Jerry ended up creating a bunch of Legionnaires like Bouncing Boy.
Right. Yeah. And really grew out this whole roster to be pretty large, all things considered. And it dawns on me, this was DC's first YA book.
Yeah.
They're all teenagers. Yeah.
Yeah, they're all teenagers. You could only be a teenager.
That's right.
In part of it. Like the Legion lore is something that's like, you know, they add to it and then they eventually drop the whole teenager thing.
Yeah, that was probably a good plan at some point. And
yeah,
if nobody caught the sarcasm, I am not calling Legion of Superheroes a YA title. Just to put that out there. But it grew. I mean, for a while there, they were introducing characters. It felt like every issue probably wasn't that aggressive. And then you had this kind of the whole world of the Legion of substitute heroes. You had the ability to get with generations of different families with some of the teenagers. I mean, you just very, very quickly, this whole world got very, very large.
Yeah, it was almost like a reflection on the fans. Because It was like everyone wanted to be a Legionnaire. And it was like a lot of the early stories revolved around Legion tryouts, you know, the Legion of substitute heroes like Night Girl and Polar Boy and those characters, you know, all these rejects who eventually form their own team.
Right.
And, you know, part of this, as this book's coming together, there really was a heavy amount of creating a lot of characters that didn't necessarily have the opportunity to have their personalities shine through, which wouldn't happen till later on in the series. But, you know, there's a person that's somewhat responsible for that we're going to get to shortly.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of the early adventures, it was very, very popular. It was outselling many of DC's other comics at this point.
Yeah,
but the stories were somewhat, I don't know, maybe shallow would be the generous word. It was they weren't necessarily that deep. They would go on little adventures. It was like a lot of the comics back in the early '60s for DC.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have them going on these like quick adventures. You'd have. I'd say the weakest point of Legion at this time is the antagonist. The antagonists all more or less sucked.
Yeah, they were easily dispatched, usually in the same issue.
Yeah, you know, like half the time would be that. It would be, you know, like very obvious creations like the Legion of Supervillains, you know, like stuff that like any idiot who would come on this book would have thought of to do.
Right.
You know, you'd have stuff like that. You'd have, you know, Lex Luthor sending a robot from the 20th century to stop the Legion. You'd have, you know, Mxyzptlk's, you know, fifth cousin from the future. You know, like that kind of stuff. They dealt with the Bizarro Legion at one point. You know, like it was a lot of very obvious. Like it wasn't like its own book yet. It was very much so intertwined with the Superman family that most of what they were dealing with was just Superman family stuff.
And it was the title was somewhat. I mean, it's still very. I still enjoyed a lot of those classic tales a lot, but it was very much it was more shallow because you decided to take the title and revolve it entirely around Superboy to some extent for some of those, and it was only setting up to serve kind of that title and the Superman family of books, something they never would repeat again in the entire history of the Legion of Superheroes. Anyway, but it's still they were able to kind of create this giant fantastical universe. It had its own style to it. It was selling very well. They did kill. So I was looking back on this, and they credit the guy we're about to talk about in a minute with making things a little bit more dark, a little bit more nuanced, but still they did kill Lightning Lad early on in this series in the
very early on. Yeah, he was. I mean, what was it? They killed him. God, it was like
really quick in the run.
Yeah, I was reading this through like the archive editions, and he was dead in the first archive and brought back in the second. You know, it was.
He was brought back to life later that year, as I recall. But
he was dead about 8 months, which was longer than Superman, I think.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, that's painful.
You know, like it's kind of crazy that he was gone for that long. And you know, you had some Legionnaires like Ultra Boy, who was like a character who we met in Superboy, who it turns out came from the future. You had characters like Brainiac 5, who ended up having like a crush on, you know, Supergirl, and then Triplicate Girl had a you know, crush on, you know, Superboy, and that kind of gets pushed to the wayside. But you know, they were really trying to interlock a lot of these characters, you know, strictly with, you know, Superboy, Supergirl.
There was an element of romance that was in a lot of these early books. It was probably one of DC's titles where they were kind of bridging sci-fi and romance and some of these elements you mentioned. Maybe actually it was a YA coming of age series.
Yeah, you know, it's a precursor to you know, one of my favorite British sci-fi shows, Blake 7.
Yeah, there you go.
You know, there's a little bit of romance, you know, in there, and sci-fi fun. But you also had a lot of characters, you know, obviously Cosmic Boy having magnetism years before Magneto being a thing, and you know, Saturn Girl basically being a, you know, Jean Grey type character very early on. Yeah.
How much do you think that, because I've always maintained this, I've never been able to make the argument, I think, as well as I'd like, but how many of the comic books do you think borrowed, being the generous word, from Legion of Superheroes? Because like you're just mentioning, especially if you were a big X-Men fan, there was a lot that showed up in the X-Men that felt lifted as nicely as possible, lifted from Legion.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Phantom Girl is just, you know, Kitty. Kitty's like it's the same character. You know, you would get more Legionnaires over time that had very similar powers. I mean, Bouncing Boy and the Blob, very similar. You know, just that idea of like he couldn't be like you couldn't like blow a hole through him with a gun or something. He would just bounce around. You know, like that. That he was like, you know, it's a little different, but
yeah,
you know, a lot of the same principles are there. Vanisher, Invisible Kid. You know, I mean, there's a lot of that stuff that, you know, heavily overlap. Triplicate Girl and Multiple Man.
Well, there were a lot of comments at one point that with Timberwolf and Wolverine had very similar, but both in terms of style and how the character was written.
Yeah. And that's there's a strong case for that, because the way Timberwolf was designed was by Dave Cockrum. And,
right.
You know, I mean, Timberwolf occurred beforehand, but when Dave Cockrum took over the book, which was a full like year and a half before X-Men, he was primarily working with Carrie Bates, or maybe exclusively. I'm trying to think if Dave Cockrum worked with any other writer than Carrie Bates. But that design of Timberwolf that looks a lot like Wolverine, that was Dave Cockrum right before he drew Wolverine like that in X-Men.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just think over and over, if especially as you go back and you read these issues, you see a lot of the powers, the personalities, the characters, the dynamics. I mean, there was a lot that happened first in Legion. And I think for whatever reason, I think people forget that it was first of all, a very, very strong comic in the 60s. It was one of the higher selling comics through the 60s and 70s. And it was kind of the go-to, I think, for both Marvel and DC and other publishers of this is how you do a team book. This is how you do superheroes.
Yeah. And I mean, you have some other things here, like issue 200 of Superboy, the wedding of Bouncing Boy and Duo Damsel. Spoiler: Triplicate Girl was, ended up losing one of her, duplicates to in a fight with Computo. Computo being one of the better person we're going to talk about villains.
Yes.
But yeah, even still, Computo. But
it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't the kind of the deep, complicated storytelling. But despite that, it was very popular. A lot of people wanted to write it. A lot of people bought the comic. A lot of fans, and we might as well. So one of those fans was a 14-year-old boy called Jim Shooter.
Yes, Jim Shooter. It's so interesting because he was reading comics and he spent a year just studying comics because he wanted to write them, and not necessarily for the reasons you would think a boy would want to write comics. It wasn't just a love of comics. He needed to provide money for his family.
Right.
He was living in the Pittsburgh area at the time. His father, I think, was a steel worker who wasn't making enough money. And he needed to bring in money.
You're telling me somebody got into comics for money?
Yeah, it was a different time, the 60s.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, and Jim was basically reading. Jim was a big Marvel fan, which is going to shock a lot of people.
What?
But that Jim, as a kid, loved Marvel comics. Get out of here.
Yeah, who knew?
So when he was reading the comics, he thought, if I could apply what Marvel was able to do to DC, he's like, I knew I could get a job there. He's like, I didn't think I could get a job at Marvel because they were already doing that. But if I applied that same thing to DC, I could get work.
Yep.
And the Legion was the group he gravitated to that he thought he could help. And part of that, which is interesting because it was both, I think, one of the Legion's greatest strengths and also its greatest detriment, was there were so many characters, no one was able to get a personality to sort of shine through. But by doing that, you were also allowing people to more easily insert themselves as like the different characters, because you could kind of build up what you thought their personality was for yourself.
Yep, absolutely.
You know, and that was so you had that, but then some of the antagonists before Jim Shooter entered the stage. I mean, when you're talking about some of the best villains being either the Legion of Supervillains, Starfinger, that was which on the cover of the first appearance of Starfinger is just like, it's so bad. It's like it's more deadly than Goldfinger. You know, like it was very much trying to make it clear that hold on, it's 335 of Adventure Comics, featuring Starfinger, the 30th century villain more dangerous than Goldfinger. And that's partly because Mort Weisinger, who was running the Super books at the time, he worked on the George Reeves Superman live action show, and he was considered this like widely creative person who helped the Superman line stay relevant and keep the sales up in the 60s. A lot of what he'd do, because he was managing a lot of books, was he'd just call freelancers and just be like, I saw this movie Goldfinger. Can you just do that?
Yeah.
You know, that was a lot of it. And he would just see episodes or like of different TV shows and just tell writers, do that. or books. You also had around that time of Starfinger, when Lightning Lad lost his arm. Like, poor Lightning Lad gets killed, then he loses his arm. You
He's
had
the rough run of it, yeah.
yeah, I think he even gets a receding hairline later.
Yeah.
But just the worst, and also ends up, spoilers, being Validus's dad, kind of, because that gets retconned a million times. But that was in the Moby Dick of space, where he lost his arm. And I really hope I don't need to tell you where they got the idea of the Moby Dick in space from.
No, probably.
But other villains at the time too were like, what was it, Jungle King, who became like Monster Master, who also sucked. You had an interesting build up before Shooter came on board, for Time Trapper.
Right.
There were issues and issues and issues where they just mentioned Time Trapper, that there was this like block in time travel, where you couldn't go past a certain year because the Time Trapper had blocked it off, and there was something nefarious going on. But by the time we end up actually meeting the Time Trapper, it's a stupid Baby Legion story.
Yeah, they kind of blew it.
Yeah, they really blow it. But and then we don't see the Time Trapper for like years. But it's all this buildup for this weird story where Time Trapper is there and there's Baby Legionnaires. But Baby Legionnaire stories happen a lot. I've also heard stories that like Mort Weisinger just like had a thing for these like baby superhero stories.
That's nothing creepy about that.
Yeah, like it happens way too much, and they're all written the same stupid way. Like, babies don't actually talk like that, but everyone who would write it would always just be like, like, me, baby, Superman, lift car. And it'd just be written like that, and you'd just be like, you dumb fucks.
It really is. And then fortunately the X-Men copied that too later with Mojo. So that was great. Yeah, no, I never understood that. There did seem there's some weird fascination with that for no reason. And they were always terrible. And then they changed the names around too. You had like Element Infant and Dream Tot and Baby Break. Like
no, for sure. And then but yeah, you'd have these things. You'd have Legion, like one of the interesting things though, especially with a character like Dream Girl, is she showed up, tried out for the Legion, didn't get in, and then like years later came back and was a member, because there was some idea of listening to the fans.
Right.
People would write in and, like, where's Dream Girl? I like Dream Girl. And, that there would be that kind of thing coming in. But right before Jim was taking over, not only did you have stupid Baby Legion stories, but it felt like, like, I guess a few issues before it came in, you had some stronger stories. Like the Computo story is actually pretty solid.
It is, yeah.
And there were a few other pretty solid stories. There was that like 2-part story where they were in like that space prison, the different Legionnaires, and they had to break out. Mm-hmm. and that was good. So you did have these 2-parter things going on. I think you also had the story where they tried to make sense of all the bad luck people had with the Luck Lords, which is, it's kind of a dud, but it was like cute that they tried to explain all the bad luck.
About that time, they did start to do stories that I think went beyond one issue, didn't they? Like that for a long time, it was one and done always.
Yeah, but before Jim came on, like issues, Adventure Comics 344, 345 was a 2-parter.
Yeah.
The Starfinger story was a 2-parter, and that was earlier. That was 335, 336. what was it? And then there was another two-parter before that with the Legion of Supervillains, where you had the that one kid, like, it was it Dynamo Boy.
Mm-hmm.
Dynamo Boy joined the Legion and sabotaged them, so that way he got all of them kicked out of the Legion, so the Legion of Supervillains could take over.
What's weird at the time, if you can kind of just imagine back, there were most comics didn't do anything bigger than a single issue. Almost everything was contained in one. And I think this was, I may be wrong about this, I've got to go look, but in the early 60s, I think Legion was the first one that did start to experiment with this. Even though, as you said, the stories were somewhat simplistic and everything else, they were trying to kind of expand. But it's also kind of mind-blowing to think that you had this comic with this really large cast doing a lot of things, and many of the issues were contained within just one comic worth of pages. And it didn't seem to really bother them. They were able to get a good story out and get things going.
Yeah, I mean, this was by like 1965. They were doing these two-part adventures,
Yeah.
and that's another thing. Like, I feel like there's a lot of like word of mouth, people just listening to other people and just taking for granted that it's the truth. That
Right.
you would hear a lot of people to this day, to this hour, saying things like, it wasn't until like the late 70s or the 80s until DC caught up to like Marvel.
Right.
And it's like, no, they were doing two-part stories almost around the same time with something like Legion. I mean, Legion isn't representative of the entire DC line, but they were doing two-part stories at a time when like Marvel was still doing a lot of one-shot stories. And they had these continuing narratives. The Time Trapper stuff was over several issues in the background.
No, absolutely. There were subplots. This is before Claremont's doing X-Men at this point.
Yeah.
And you had, and then you mentioned earlier, you had Jim Shooter, who was reading Marvel, liked kind of the more serious take they were doing on things, wanted to take it to DC. He's 14 writing his own Legion stories. And sorry, this is the other part about Jim Shooter. And I've done commentary on Jim Shooter. I think people have the impression I dislike Jim Shooter. That's not it. It's just there's more to Jim Shooter's career than he was an editor at Marvel who, bossed around the super hippie creators. He had a whole world before that, and it's a pretty cool one.
It's a cool one that involves a lot of creations in his teens.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
He was hired a year later. So he was hired to write when he was 15 at DC.
He was 14. He wrote his first scripts when he was 13.
That's it. Yes, that's right. He wrote his first scripts at 13.
Yeah.
He was hired at 14. And he's kind of applauded for being one of the better writers at the time.
Yeah. And if you read these books like in order, it is, you're reading a Jim Shooter issue. Like there wasn't that much of a difference between Jerry Siegel and Edmund Hamilton at the time. No offense to either of them.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it was a little, you could switch back and forth. John Forte, I think it's important to say he really, cemented the look of the Legion for a long time. But, he unfortunately passed away at the end of 64. And then Kurt Swan became the regular, artist on the book. Right. And what Jim did, because he didn't know at the time, like he didn't have an understanding that, there's a writer, artist, inker, all this. He drew the first issue he did.
Yeah, he kind of did it all himself.
Yeah, and Kurt Swan basically cleaned it up. And then from there on out, Jim was one of the only writers who would actually draw the, page layouts.
Right.
And in his first story, I mean, you already see him start. It's Adventure Comics 347. you already start seeing him. Oh, it's 346. It might be. Sorry. Yes, 346. You already start seeing him do things like figure out a vernacular for how kids would talk. I think the first issue he does, he starts using things like poppin' planets, like stuff like that. It's silly, but it's something that like brings some life to the Legion. It's like, oh, this is like, okay, there's a vernacular that these kids use. And, and that's cool. And unlike almost anyone that came before him or since, I mean, we're talking about that first issue he did, 346, creating 4 Legionnaires.
Yep.
And the Khunds, which were a race of aliens that are very similar to the Klingons before the Klingons existed.
Yeah. So, I mean, just stepping back there, so you have this kid, and it is truly a kid coming in, 14 years old, puts on the book, comes up with the Karate Kid and multiple other Legionnaires, the Khunds, this whole world that was clearly, I mean, I'm sure he was influenced by things, but to your point, like the Klingons came later. Like a lot of this stuff came later. There's this weird behavior with Legion of Superheroes, and I think Jim Shooter as well, where they attribute him copying things from other people, but he didn't. They didn't exist yet. Like I've seen, it's mind blowing, and he only did it with like mild help from Christos Gage, from what I understand.
Yeah, no, it was just very. He came in to help seal the deal at the end, but
to make sure it went out on time.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you had this going on. This is 1966.
Yes.
That he's coming up with this stuff. A character like Karate Kid. Karate Kid would be the first Legionnaire to get his own separate series. He had a 12-issue solo run in the 70s.
Yep.
But that was, I think, might have been Paul Levitz's first full issue work. But
I think so.
Yeah, I think. But another important thing too, Karate Kid, 1966. This was well before the martial arts craze in the 70s.
Yes.
Well before.
Way before anything Marvel was doing in that place. And keep in mind, this is 66. So if you think about where Marvel's at the moment, they're very early in their runs with all their titles. And you get these very distinctive personalities. You get the whole different language. You get new characters. You get a ton. Basically, before Jim Shooter turns 18, he's got 40 odd issues under his belt or more.
Yeah.
And he's not only written kind of a major part of this universe, he's brought in Mordu, he's brought in the Dark Circle, he's got the Adult Legion. I mean, there's just a ton that he's put together, and he's easily the youngest person working in comics at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, like, the other Legionnaires, he created, in just this first issue, Princess Projectra, Jecki went on to be a fairly popular Legionnaire, and, Pharaoh Lad, who would go on to be the first Legionnaire who's, like, really killed off.
Yeah, actually did.
Nemesis Kid, who would go on to be a continuing Nemesis for the Legion. A pretty popular villain, and then that was a 2-part story. And then the next issue, he creates, Dr. Regulus, who's another like sort of fan favorite kind of villain who keeps popping up as an antagonist, primarily to, Sunboy. And that's, that was done in a way, it gave Sunboy like something to do. Like Jim was figuring things out, like, oh, if I can give, villains to certain characters, I can give them like a purpose.
Yeah. Who knew? What?
Yeah.
It's amazing. And the amount of material that I think he put in place, I mean, it easily carried the title for like another 10 years or more. I mean, hell, for that matter, if there's ever a Legion of Superheroes true effort in Hollywood, either with a show or a cartoon or anything else, it feels like Shooter's run is going to be a lot of what they dip into.
Absolutely. And to be fair, there was some stuff that was set up earlier that was interesting. Like before the Summers family was a thing, you had Lightning Lad, Light Lass, and Lightning Lord.
Yeah, right.
You know, all of them having lightning powers, and then they switch Light Lass's powers because technically you can't have a Legionnaire that just has the same power as someone else, so they change your power. You know, it's science. But
it all works out.
yeah, but again, this like Claremont kind of stuff, you know, like a decade before Claremont was really all in on this kind of stuff, you had this family drama, you know, playing out in the Legion. But I mean, you know, he is 14, 15, 16 when he is creating, you know, the Fatal Five, which are easily probably the most well-known villains of the Legion of Superheroes.
Yeah.
You know, Universo is another, you know, big one he created. You know, the Dominators, who were used in the Invasion, which was a big event right after Crisis. But the Dominators have, you know, been in the future and the past and are a continual threat throughout the DC universe. They're a big deal.
And it is I don't know. It's amazing to me because it is. I would you say it's fair that it seems likely that Chris Claremont at least took a decent amount of inspiration from this Legion run in the 60s.
I believe so. I believe he's even admitted it. I'm trying to think. It's been a little bit, but I've read the letters columns in like some of those like earlier Uncanny issues. And I'm pretty sure he answered one of them in a way that was basically like, oh, you know, from like, you know, that comic, like, you know, like that he didn't say Legion, but he was referring to it. And I got distracted before, but that Superboy issue 200, that's the Macron crystal in the wedding ceremony. It's just, you know, like Cockrum just moving that over. And Cockrum was fresh off Legion doing X-Men, so he had all these ideas, I'm sure, that he was like, oh, let's just do that. You know, that he was going to do with the Legion. And Cockrum has straight up said Nightcrawler was just something that I think Murray Boltinoff didn't want to use, so he used that. And then Storm, I think, was an amalgamation of two, like, failed Legionnaires.
Yep.
And, I mean, Pharaoh Lad is, you know, Colossus is Pharaoh Lad.
Yeah.
You know?
No, they definitely wrap over, and a lot of these stories are enjoyable. And I think when Shooter came on, they did get reasonably dark as well.
Oh, yeah, you had Shooter. Shooter basically thought you needed to kill off a Legionnaire if you're going to raise these stakes. And the stories he wanted to tell with the Sun Eater, who I believe this version of the Sun Eater was created by Jim, but I think Jerry Siegel might have created another thing called the Sun Eater, or like it was a weapon. That's a little. I'm a little less certain with that, but you know, you had him basically go, okay, if we're going to do a big story, I want to kill off a Legionnaire. DC basically wasn't too keen on him killing off a character that he didn't create. So he was like, fine, you know, I created this character, so let me kill him off.
Yep.
And Pharaoh Lad seemed like the logical choice. Interesting story about the Fatal Five. The story came about because, you know, Mort Weisinger calls Jim and just goes like, Jim, there's this movie, The Dirty Dozen. I just want you to write that as a comic book.
I love the impression.
Thank you. And then Jim didn't want to tell Mort, like, I can't go to the movies because we're poor.
Right.
So Jim finds a newspaper that has like a summary of the movie and writes this 2-part issue based on like a summary of The Dirty Dozen in the newspaper. and you know, he's like, okay, I got the basic idea of we're going to use these like villains, you know, these like morally reprehensible people to basically do a suicide mission.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you get the Fatal Five. And I mean, like, just the creativity. I mean, having like a character like Persuader who's just like, I have an axe that can cut through gravity.
Yeah.
You know, like it's just great. And Emerald Empress, is really, stood out and has been an antagonist outside the Legion, and all of that. It's just great that the Emerald Eye, like just all that stuff. It's so cool. Just like Tharok and Mono and Validus, they're really cool, interesting characters. And the way Jim does it, that adds an extra layer of darkness to it, is the Legion basically is the ones who introduce all of these horrific villains to each other to do this mission. And then afterwards they decide, oh, we work really well together. We should be a villain team.
Yeah.
Which again is like, I don't think even like anything at Marvel was coming close to something like that, where heroes accidentally introduce villains who are like, you know what, we're a good villain team.
No, it was inventive. It was different. It was very different for DC because it did cast things in a darker light. You had some great stories in there, which I think in many cases gave DC a bit of a template for how to do villains in their other books. And you did see this kind of transformation happen with DC in the late 60s, kind of early 70s, through a lot of this effort and everything that was going on. But it really, I mean, you can't lay all the credit at Jim Shooter alone, but there's a big, healthy amount of it that goes at his feet when he was doing this stuff in his teenage years.
Yeah, and when you're looking through this and you're seeing the kind of stuff he's doing, how him doing the layouts for Kurt Swan really also elevated Kurt Swan's work here. You started seeing less of the sort of stiff panel work, and you see some more adventurous layouts and interesting work going into these books. And this is around the same time, like a little deeper into his run, where you had rising star Neil Adams doing the covers for Adventure Comics.
Right.
And, you started moving a little away from a lot of the more corny stuff that was happening. Like, there were constantly just like kryptonite meteor showers and stuff like that would just cripple Superboy, or like, everyone had like a kryptonite bullet or some shit in
yes
things, or like a dog was just like, oh no, I'm weak because a dog ate kryptonite. Just ridiculous stuff like that Jim was sort of moving away from. And, when the Fatal Five would come back under Jim, he again did it in a way where the Legion kind of unwittingly freed the Fatal Five. So it was still partially like their fault.
So with a slight interruption, Shooter would continue to do Legion of Superheroes till about the mid 70s.
Yeah.
And then he takes off and goes over to Marvel, and that's where more people, I think, know of Shooter. What's weird to me is that, and not that this is a video about Shooter, so I don't want to go too down this path, but Marvel hires him over to be an editor, but it felt like at that moment they did ignore kind of the talent of him as a writer and kind of plotter for the books. Did you find that odd that it felt like a really obvious thing for Marvel to do would be to have him? I mean, he did do some writing, but it was he moved to editorial really quickly. Or is that fair?
No, he did. I mean, he took a brief couple of years kind of away. He had gotten into NYU, ended up not going. What was working? I think he worked briefly in editorial at Marvel, because he got Marvel took him for editorial in the early 70s, like 71 or 72, and then he left to come back to Legion because DC basically offered him a better gig, but it didn't turn out to be a better gig.
Right. The people he was working with, he had a lot of conflict with.
He had a lot of conflict with Julie Schwartz and particularly Murray Boltinoff. Boltinoff apparently, even according to his own assistant, had like, it might have been early onset Alzheimer's or dementia. He had serious memory issues.
Yeah.
Where Jim was constantly having fights with Murray because Murray would forget telling him things. And then Jim would do what he was originally told. Murray would forget that he told him that and then chew him out for it.
Yeah.
It was a really bad environment. It's the kind of environment that you probably couldn't get away with today. Murray probably would have been forced into retirement if that was the case, and by today's standards. But and he had conflict with other people on Legion, like Mike Grell. He was like difficult to work with at the time. But they basically said, you're going to come in and we want you to we're not only going to let you do Legion stories where, Carrie Bates was doing most of the Legion stuff at that point, with a little bit from E. Nelson Bridwell, who was Mort's assistant editor, who went on to continue editing and writing at DC. But it ended up, he ended up, I don't think, getting the work he wanted to get. I don't think he got the Superman books he thought he was going to get. He did a decent amount of Legion, and then Marv Wolfman called to bring him back to Marvel, which is kind of ironic because Jim would end up being editor-in-chief, and I'm pretty sure Jim was a big factor in Marv leaving Marvel and going to DC.
And so as Shooter kind of ultimately leaves, Legion then started. We basically got. We're not at Levitz yet.
Yeah, not yet. It's Carrie Bates is the one who really takes over. But even before that, I mean, one of the other really interesting things that Shooter did, I think it was an adventure 359 or in or around then. It was the Ghost of Farrelad issue, where he has statues dedicated to other Legionnaires who have fallen, who didn't exist yet.
Right.
Jim was really doing interesting stuff, and there was statues of Chemical King and Shadowlass who he would introduce later in his run. And people really played with that. He, said that, Saturn Girl and Lightning Lad were married,
Mm-hmm.
and had set all this stuff up. And, people would use that, as a template for the Legion for forever for introducing characters. People would go back to that issue and a lot of the other things that Jim did, and just mine that for material for years and years. I mean, a lot of the early Carrie Bates stuff was all returns of returns of the Fatal Five, return of Dr. Regulus, return of other villains. He also brought back Starfinger, which was weird, but
well, you always bring back Starfinger.
Yeah, but Carrie Bates. Mort Weisinger, apparently, according to Mort's son in a recent interview, was more taken by Carrie Bates than Jim. And I don't mean to say this in any way to disparage Carrie, but he just was not as good as Jim. Jim revolutionized things in a way that Carrie, not on Legion, Carrie basically wrote almost the entirety of Flash's Bronze Age, including the death of Iris West, which is finally being collected.
Yeah, and there were, but he was also. I agree with you, by the way, on Bates and just, but they did have Dave Cockrum during that period.
Yeah,
and then they had Mike Grell during that period.
Yeah, artistically it was great. A lot of the stories weren't as strong, and I mean even Dave Cockrum will admit the first Dave Cockrum issue that he drew, or a story rather, of Carrie Bates was Matter Eater Lad's brother put a microchip in his cereal to emit bad thoughts, so Saturn Girl would think he was a traitor. It was stupid.
It's a common scenario. I mean, it does play out all the time. My wife's
Yeah,
like,
no, for sure.
so yeah.
Which reminds me too, one of the really interesting bits. One of the last things Jim did before he left Legion the first time, he'd eventually come back, was a story about Matter Eater Lad, where it was like a self-insert character. The Hapless Hero, which was in Action Comics 381, where Matter Eater Lad was basically, Jim Shooter was Matter Eater Lad, and his family was dependent on his check, and like his dad was abusive, and his mom wouldn't work and needed the money. And he wrote that into one of his last Legion stories in like that first run.
Yeah, I mean during this period though, sales remained relatively strong. I was just trying to look at the 70s. The Legion book was still in the top 25%, I think, of what DC was doing.
Oh yeah.
And including as it got to kind of the late 70s, and this is where Levitz comes in. You did get this kind of DC implosion, and you had DC canceling a lot of the books, but Legion was never even remotely considered one of those. Legion was probably one of the bedrock titles that they were going to stick with.
Yeah, it was selling better than Detective Comics.
Yeah. And so, of course, you did get Paul Levitz come in. You had Jerry Conway come in.
Yep.
And you got to probably what I think a lot of kind of the other big era that a lot of people remember from the Bronze Age and kind of that time period of the Legion. I think probably you have the stuff that Jim Shooter did, and you have the stuff that Paul Levitz did. Is that fair to say that those two are probably the big kind of names that people remember, or those eras of the book were the ones that people remember, or is that discounting a lot of people?
No, I don't think in terms of writers it's discounting a lot of people. I think you had great artists in the 70s like Cockrum, like Grell, like James Sherman, Joe Staten did art there for a little while.
You had some Steve Ditko in there as well.
Yeah, a little Steve Ditko, a little bit of Walt Simonson, not too much, but just a little bit. Which is a lot of his career. Is like just a little bit of Batman, just a little bit of Legion. But then I think you had Paul and Keith Giffen, which was like I mean people still go back to that as like the gold standard of the book, but a lot of that bedrock was all set by Jim. I mean, Paul was a fan of Jim Legion. It's I mean, a lot of people were. I think Roger Stern, Mark Waid, like a lot of big names. If they were reading DC at the time, it was because of people like Jim Shooter, and Jim would also do other things even outside the Legion. He created Parasite at 14. One of these staple Superman villains that I think most people, it's probably one of the most popular villains that hasn't had like a main, like a big movie that featured him.
Yep.
And at 14 years old. And that Superman Flash race, that came from Superman 199, and that was Jim Shooter. I think it was 17 at the time.
It's crazy to think about that amount of work at that age. I keep going back to it, but it is an incredible amount of contribution so early and stuff people remember. But it is well, I should say people remember those stories. The weird part is it seems like very few people remember it was Jim Shooter behind them, having done a lot of this stuff. But the other one I went to read, and it's one of my favorite books of all time. I've got multiple copies of it here. Is of course the Great Darkness Saga, which would come a little later. But that is almost one of the most definitive Legion stories there's ever been.
Yeah, the one heartbreaking thing about the Great Darkness Saga is because of the trade dressing, you can never surprise anyone with the twist.
That's true.
It's so embedded in it being a dark side story that people, it's easy to forget that was a huge twist. They never had the new gods in, the Legion before. We didn't know if Darkseid was still going to be a thing 1,000 years later.
Yeah.
And it was great. And that was, Paul, I think, started writing again. He took a break. He was on Legion for a little bit. And I think, to his own admission, he feels that it was it wasn't the best he could have done, and was afraid that was going to be like his only chance. But then he got to come back for Legion of Superheroes issue 284, and was able to start setting up this Great Darkness Saga and bring Darkseid in, and this is early 80s. I want to say this is like a year after like Dark Phoenix Saga, or a year, maybe two.
And this is where the Legion was doing some pretty amazing things. But as I mentioned, at this point, Claremont, the X-Men, and Marvel kind of in general have taken the spotlight and are definitely getting the attention for the big storylines. But the Great Darkness Saga, I would argue, is a better all-around story than the Dark Phoenix Saga.
Yeah.
Many
it's great. I mean, I love the Dark Phoenix Saga.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's it wasn't really designed to be like, the Great Darkness Saga is more of like a straightforward kind of story.
Yes.
And other villains like Dr. Regulus and characters like that, pop back up, and we get like the sprinklings of Darkseid's minions, all leading up to the reveal that Darkseid's returned. But the Dark Phoenix Saga is a little more all over the place. Like, it's a little more like this happens, and then Jean gets crazy, and then she's not crazy, and then they have to fight the Shi'ar, and it's not as clean.
Well, the Dark Phoenix Saga always felt like kind of a continuing story. It was very much like Claremont. They collected a couple issues up. It was a Dark Phoenix Saga, but it was really just this kind of rolling story with a number of plots that were going at the time.
Yeah.
Whereas the Great Darkness Saga, on the other hand, for the Legion, was something that was set up, and then it was a story. It was a very kind of definitive, beginning and end, and with Darkseid, and then it also had some clear kind of aftermath things that then would roll out. But it wasn't like just this kind of ongoing story that it felt like people just collected together and called it a day. This felt like a really serious kind of event level threat.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was huge, and then the fallout from that, which is part of where we get, Validus being, the son of Saturn Girl and Lightning Lad through the curse. Like, that there was a curse that had serious consequences.
Yeah, and it played out for, a long time. I mean, the events of this would carry them through the 80s in a lot of ways. And then but this is where it was during the 80s that we started to muck about with crises and other craziness that started to derail the book, I think.
Yeah, well, what ended up happening is you had Crisis on Infinite Earths, and this is a problem that persists today at the big two, is trying to, like, instead of reevaluating and figuring out where things are going and doing something forward thinking, it's going back to the past.
Right.
And so instead of deciding, you know what, Batman and Superman aren't as popular anymore, let's continue propping up and build from here, they sabotaged popular books to the detriment of their sales in order to try to spark more excitement in their more floundering properties.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it was interesting because I guess we could take a look at this and say the Legion of Superheroes arguably came about from DC listening to their fans and telling that, hey, there's interest here. There's people who like these characters, this universe, everything that you're doing. Let's do more with this universe because it's exciting, and let's give the fans what they want. And then you do see things. I think you see the combination of both some characters showing some wear and tear, and them throwing a wrench in successful titles. I mean, it was interesting because the Legion, while not as popular in the 80s as it was in the 70s, was still trucking as one of kind of DC's big properties, a successful thing, something that was bringing in lots of money. And then they get mired in Crisis. And they also seem to get into this obsession that we've seen to carry out over the last 30 years or so of needing to explain things. So when they started to crossover with John Byrne and what he was doing over in Superman, they then decide, hey, this origin of Superboy and the Legion and all that kind of stuff didn't make a lot of sense. Let's make sure we explain that because we can't be confusing to the readers. But what I question is, I don't know that anybody was confused in the first place. They just wound up confusing people by trying to insert this history that wasn't necessary. People were already on board and enjoying the title as it was.
Yeah, there's really no need to over-explain these kind of characters. It's like, oh, these are superheroes in the future. End it there.
Yeah,
but,
that's the end.
Yeah, but instead, and you'd have things like Paul tried to bring back Supergirl as I think it was Censor Girl.
Yeah.
And they ended up having to scrap that and decided it was Jackie instead of Supergirl because Editorial put their foot down, which wouldn't be a problem for Paul a decade or so later when he became publisher. But
yeah,
it's which is also interesting that two of the biggest writers to ever tackle Legion of Superheroes ended up running the two biggest companies at different points.
No, that's true. Yeah, I mean, maybe it speaks to the quality of the title. I don't know. I think that people who had, in my experience, people have a deep love for the Legion who really kind of embrace it and understand it, seem to do well. I mean, even Bendis has cited the Legion as one of his favorite books when he was a kid. And I don't know, maybe there's just a coincidence there, but it seems like the people who really took a lot of inspiration from this comic seem to do well in comics.
Yeah, because it's basically everything you want in a comic. I think, at least for like superhero comic, especially like a sci-fi comic, and you'll also see a lot of what Jim Shooter does when left to his own devices. When you look at especially what he did at like places like Valiant, he's a very sci-fi oriented person, and you see all that in the Legion.
It feels like a lot of and there's still a lot of money to be made off the Legion. I don't know. So I'm curious what you thought. I remember reading along with Legion. I was a fan of the book, enjoyed it immensely, read the Magic Wars, and then they did the time skip, and Giffen took over. How did you like that time? Did that? I remember that lost a lot of people, but it was, I don't know. I was on for the ride, but it was weird. Suddenly everybody has a jacket. It's like,
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I don't think it's as bad as everyone kind of thought, because that was, I think, probably the first major divide of fans, especially like a vocal divide. And I think there were a lot of people who felt betrayed because they were like, "Oh, Keith Giffen, we love him. He's going to do right by us." And
right.
And I think it went in a direction people were not necessarily looking forward to because it was a lot darker than it had been before. I'm probably going to end up picking up that gigantic omnibus that's like the first half of that and like do like a proper reread of all of that in the near future. But I tend to, when I go to some of the stuff in the Legion in the past couple of decades or so, like, I don't hate it as much, or I'm not as upset by it. I don't think a lot of this stuff hits the same highs as the 70s and early 80s or the Jim Shooter stuff in the 60s. The only thing that really did for me was some of what Dan Abbott, Andy Lanning, and Olivier Coipel did.
Right.
That stuff I liked. I really like Legion Lost a lot. Although the way they I feel like you also need to read like Legion World with that, and they didn't. I forget if they never collected it or they collected it so briefly, but it's an important companion piece, and it's more difficult to read. I have the single issues, but
It,
yeah,
it's hard to really digest what happened because it felt like through the the 70s, a lot of growth, 80s, a lot of popularity, and then they did this time skip, and like you said, there's this big divide, and I remember people thinking at the time that it was this attempt to kind of make the Legion into this kind of 90s edgy. People have leather and coats, and it was just darker, more extreme. But it didn't, it is like you said. I don't think it's as bad as some people remember it, but it felt like from that point on, there were some good stories in there. There was some stuff around Zero Hour. Chris Sprouse did a bit during that time period. There was some good stories, but it never really seemed to find its way after that. It feels like every few years, maybe about every 10 years, they have to kind of pull the rug out from under the Legion again. And it seems like it's never really gotten back to where it was.
Yeah, I mean, DC Comics editorial is the greatest antagonist that Legion has ever known.
Yes.
But yeah, there are other shining little moments. Tom Pyre, I think, will tell anyone if you want to read his DC work to read his Dr. Fate run.
Right.
But he did some Legion stuff, and there's some issues that stood out for me. That there was that one. It's like a one-shot issue of like. It's not exactly a what if, but it's like a version of the Legion that's like, what if there was like a Golden Age Legion?
Yeah.
And that's really sweet. I really enjoy that one. It's like a one and done kind of story, and that's really cool. I don't know if this is a controversial opinion or not, but I could care less about Mark Waid's run.
There's not much in Mark Waid's run. It was weird because Waid was one of the people who talked about really kind of loving the Legion and everything else, but then he got his chance on the book, and nothing really happened. It changed some stuff around, and it just never. I don't know. He wanted to do a kind of George Orwell take on space, and it was just it never gelled anywhere. It felt like Jeff Johns may have had a chance to do something with it, or like it felt like he had some of the right idea, but it was never full on his attention.
No, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of missed opportunities. I think for me, outside of the Dan Abbott, Andy Lanning stuff, there's the pre-New 52, like the Jeff Johns stuff that goes into like the Paul Levitz stuff.
The Final Crisis stories, and
yeah, like that's it's not the same, but it's fine. I think you get some like Philomena's art in there, and then like I read the New 52 stuff. Some of it's worth it just for Paul and Keith being together again for a few issues.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's Paul never quite got the magic back after that, which very few people do. That is not a knock on Paul. It is, and honestly, it's probably better than it has any right to be. Better than when Jim Shooter briefly came back like a little over a decade ago.
Yeah.
And then
Shooter's return came too late, or or he wasn't given the time it needed, or I don't know. The second the later Shooter return didn't really go anywhere.
No, and then it's you have that, and it's sad in a way that two people like Mark Waid and Brian Michael Bendis, two people I have met, I have no ill will towards. I have only had positive experiences with them. I really want to stress that these are two people that love the Legion, and I couldn't care less what they've done with the Legion.
It's painful. So with Waid, he wanted to tell a story that just didn't feel like it ever landed. It was wrong place, wrong time, or I don't know. And maybe some of it's I like Barry Kinston as well, but it didn't feel like a great fit for the title either. It felt odd. Where Bendis is concerned is more puzzling to me because I've met Bendis as well. I've had a good time with him, and I believe him. I mean, he's credited a deep love for the Legion of Superheroes as long as I've known him.
Yeah,
and I believe it. Yet, yeah, it's just not the book. It feels like people, and really the attempts the last 20 years, feel like people who come in and they try and do their take on Legion, and it forgets what made Legion popular or why people liked it. It sucks all the charm out of it and turns it into just other things. And Bendis feels like he kind of wants to do a reality show of a bunch of kind of superhero teen jokesters. It doesn't. I don't know. It's strange. It does not land.
The magic that was Jim Shooter's run, that elevated not only Adventure Comics but the DC line, that I think was so important, is it was forward thinking.
Yeah,
and everyone, particularly, I don't want to speak for Wade or Bendis or some of these people because I've not discussed it with them. It feels like all going backwards. It feels like I want to go back in time to find what I liked and try to recreate that, instead of someone like Jim Shooter, who was like, fuck that. I'm looking ahead. I'm creating new Legionnaires. I'm creating new villains. Like there was a problem with the antagonists not being interesting. Forget that. I'm going to make all these, he created so many characters. He created enough characters to create like your own line of books with, and instead everyone goes back. They're like, oh, I want to go back to the Legionnaires I like. I want to go back to the villains I like. I want to keep mining everything that Jim did. I just want to have Saturn Girl, Cosmic Boy, and Lightning Lad, fight the Fatal Five.
Yeah, it is. It's like maybe the best way I've seen it described is that it's kind of like a J.J. Abrams type take of wanting to pull nostalgia and wanting to kind of do a wink and a nod to the old series, but forgetting what made the old series successful. And as you said, I think that's both Shooter and I think Levitz as well. They pushed for new stuff. They pushed for future. They pushed for character building and world building and really trying to create some new things. And you see the love of the series in the cool stuff they created, as opposed to kind of staring backward and saying, hey, let's remember this cool thing we did here. Remember this other cool thing. Remember that other cool thing. They let the love come out in the creation.
Yeah. And people like Dave Cockrum, Mike Grell, James Sherman, Keith Giffen, who, especially, earlier on with like Cockrum and Grell, like really like, those are probably the first two who really were like, oh, you know what? Let's start changing up the costumes. Let's start doing something new. Let's refresh them. Let's make them look like adults. Let's, do these other things. And, it was important. But it's like, instead of going, thinking forward, I would rather someone do something like Mike Grell, where you just put Cosmic Boy in a corset and, you deal with people mocking you for it for decades.
Yeah.
It's like, I would rather that than everyone else who just keeps taking the Legion and goes like, let's just go right back to the Silver Age costumes. It's,
yeah.
It's like there's a lot of that going back. Olivier Coipel did some interesting stuff with the costumes in his run, but I mean, like Barry Kitson and some of these other guys. It's just going back to variations like the Silver Age look, having these Silver Age sensibilities, and it feels old and tired, and it's like people forgetting, like at the time it wasn't old and tired, it was contemporary.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. And it really feels like it's trying to cash in on something that was once popular, as opposed to saying, we've got this really cool property, let's make it popular again.
Yes.
And I think it could easily be done. The crazy part is, I think that there's we've seen these shows on Netflix and other places where world building, what they did with Game of Thrones, all the rest. It's so many people in comics tell me, not as much anymore, but this is a few years ago, that they were doing a Game of Thrones pitch. That Game of Thrones was that's what the comic needed to feel like. And if there was ever a comic that could, was a natural fit for a huge cast and a lot of moving parts and a lot of big world expansive building, not the same tone, but just that idea of being able to play with a lot of moving parts, Legion, there's no other comic that comes close, but nobody's really trying.
Yeah, it's like instead of taking a property like this where you can really do some interesting like Games of Thrones type stuff, it's like forcing it in books like Batman, or things like that. Forcing it in these like solo books where now every solo superhero now has is a giant IP farm with a ton of variations, and there's a billion Spider-Mans and Batmans and Spider-Man, Supermans and Wonder Womans, and it's all exhausting.
Yeah, it's funny. I think because that is what we're looking likely to see out of DC throughout 2021, 2022 is this lean into the Batman family and the Wonder Woman family and the Green Lantern family and the Superman family, and how many variations of these characters can we get? And meanwhile, you've got this property sitting over here with a lot of love, a lot of source material. I mean, the other part is like Marvel's mined a lot of their classic stories. There's just so many Legion stories out there that nobody has done anything with, and they're just, I mean, there's decades of movies and properties and things to do.
No, there absolutely is, and there's something so sweet and hopeful about the Legion. This idea that a group of teenagers sort of got together with the help of I guess trillionaire or whatever he'd be at that time, R.J. Brand,
Yep.
to do something positive for the universe in the memory of the ideal of Superman and Superboy. This idea that there was this hero, that the idea that Superman was so good and righteous and did so well for the world that people idolize him and want to be him 1,000 years later
Yeah.
is a really sweet and touching story. And you can do so much with that.
You can. I think there's a lot of different pieces that took. It's a very fun read. It's an optimistic. It's an enjoyable read. Even when it was darker, it was still just a very, very fun universe. With all the writers we talked about back, especially during the kind of 60s and 70s and 80s, it felt like its own little land, and it's something you can get lost into. So you read a lot more of this than I did in preparing for this. I feel like the schmuck.
Oh,
but
we've all read plenty, and
it's if you're somebody who's right now thinking that you don't like what's going on in comics, and you can't find anything for you, there's like 30 plus 40 plus years of comics here with this one property alone that could be your 2021. Just go there.
Yeah, they're all the Silver Age is collected in omnibus format. It's like 3 omnibuses. There's a lot of other stuff still in print. From the Bronze Age. They're putting out trades. I think first time collecting this. I think issues like 260 to 283 next year. They're in like 2 trades. So there's still stuff that hasn't really been collected that's coming out. The back issues, you could probably get a lot of them pretty cheap too, but it really is a special book. It's a book that really listened to the fans. It's a book that listened, like when fans would write in about who should be the leader of the Legion.
Yeah,
They'd They'd write in and draw in costumes that costume redesigns that would later become the costumes, like Saturn Girl's first costume change was by a fan. You had a lot of fanzines, like Legion Outposts, that was actively involved with DC. They would get people like Dave Cockrum, who was drawing Legion at the time, was interviewing with them, and I think Julie Schwartz and other people. It was fans writing in and making it known how much they loved Jim Shooter that got Jim Shooter to come back. There was, and Legion Outpost ran for like a little over a decade, I want to say. I think it was about 10 issues total. But when I'm talking about something like Legion Outpost, for people who aren't familiar, people from all over the country were writing in, and they were creating, before the internet, creating their own fan magazine to distribute to people that were fans, that they were interviewing and working with people who had worked, were working on, or would later work on the Legion. There were people involved who later got to be a part of, working on the Legion.
No, it's by far, I think, one of the titles that just over time had one of the greatest kind of fan connections to the properties. Very hardcore fans, people who are very, very much attached to these characters. And you haven't seen that in the last 20 odd years, nearly as much as, well, you just haven't seen it in the last 20 years. But there was a period of time, this was the dominant comic in a lot of ways. This was a team that people cared about. There's a lot of passion for, and it's great stuff. It's a title I absolutely love. It's easily one of the fondest memories I have in comics is collecting these characters and learning about them and juggling this universe in my own head. It's great stuff. Joe, anything else we want to say about Legion before we wrap this one up?
Yeah, I mean, the other things too are, you know what? I think you can start at the beginning. I really think, like, if you're a seasoned comics fan and you've read Silver Age stuff before, start with the Silver Age stuff. If you haven't, you're more of a Bronze Age person. I mean, you could dive into the Great Darkness Saga. I think that's fine.
You can, but I you know what, your point is taken. I don't think this ages bad. I mean, obviously it ages. Obviously, it's a product of the time, but you should, don't be scared of going back to those Silver Age issues. They're not wonky and terrible. There's good stuff there. There's a lot of good characterization, and I think it is one of the titles that probably holds up a lot better than most.
Yeah, and I think it holds up better than a lot of stuff in the Silver Age. It holds up better than some of Marvel's Silver Age.
Oh, for sure. I absolutely think it does.
Yeah, and when we're talking about Legion Outposts and stuff like that, I mean, this in the 70s, you had fans who were writing into the letter columns of books, but they brought the Legion back. There was a time where Mort Weisinger, they kept trying to extend his tenure at DC, and basically what ended up happening was they needed him to do a Supergirl book. So he bumped Legion from Adventure Comics and made Supergirl there starting at issue 381, and relegated Legion to a backup in Action Comics. And it was over time, people writing in, fans demanding more Legion, that the Legion then was building up again and went to Superboy. And in one of probably the only times in comic history that a backup kind of thing like the Legion went to Superboy and then kicked Superboy out of his own comic after a while.
Yes.
Like, it's crazy. And if you want to talk about, like, if you think the internet right now where people are like shipping characters and this one's gay or that, like, that was all going on 50 years ago.
Yes.
In the Legion, I mean, all this stuff about, Element Lad being gay was all inferenced through different issues, or people writing in being like, like Monel and Shadowlass have to get together, and when is Saturn Girl and Lightning Lad going to get married, and like there was all that shipping, and
Oh yeah.
Legion had a larger female audience than a lot of comics at the time too.
Yeah, and through the 80s and even the 90s as well. It was definitely a more mixed gender kind of audience for the title. And I don't know, it had a special attachment that you didn't see in other comic books, and we do not see anywhere really today. Not at the same level. Although your point is right. I think a lot of the shipping, the stuff you see on social media around various things they'd like to have happening in comics, you were seeing it with Legion. But maybe one of the differences is it felt like the people who were shipping back in the day with the Legion were actually fans of the comic.
Well, no, you were reading the comic, and you had to read the comic. You couldn't just watch a movie or a cartoon, or watch clips of something. You had to be reading the comic. That was the only way you could consume the Legion.
Right.
So that was a big part of it. But yeah, it was a big fan community. It's still fan community. There are big Facebook groups and things like that. There's a lot of people that worked on Legion over the years that Mike Grell still, he talked about how the Legion, helped really give him his career, and he still has those loyal fans, and even people who didn't work on the Legion a ton, like Mindy Newell wrote some stories, and any Legion fan, it's like you worked on the Legion, like a lot of these people are just are thrilled to be around someone who got to work on the Legion. I mean, it's really it's a wonderful book that's created a strong, a passionate following. I'm sure it would be, there are elements that are probably off-putting to some because people have strong opinions about errors they like, and
as it happens, yes.
Yeah, some people are absolutely hate what's going on now. Some people are like, I don't care. The fact that it exists is good enough for me.
That's
And all of that is valid. And if you never gave the Legion a shot, and you care about comics as a community and community building, and wanting to be part of something, like, you gotta read the Legion.
You do. And I think for people who are fans of Jim Shooter, talk about him regularly as being a major force, it's important to look at his origins and kind of how he got in, and what he did, and why it mattered, and why a lot of what he put in place was relevant 30, 40 years later. How this team came about. And like you said, I would strongly urge people, don't be afraid of tapping into Legion. It's easy to get into. You can find books. You can find omnibuses and collections. You can find stuff at half-price bookstores. A lot of it is, I think, in the DC digital app right now, if that's the way you want to consume it. You can get to a lot of it. Not all of it, but you can get to enough where you can definitely start to dig into this world.
Yeah, absolutely, and I strongly encourage people to, anyone who likes superhero comics, anyone who wants to see, something as hopeful as people inspired by Superman fighting for justice 1,000 years from now. Anyone who likes science fiction, I mean, there's a lot here. Anyone who likes Claremont X-Men, like, come on, like all those elements of the inner personal conflicts, and jealousy, and who's dating who, and all that stuff's in here as well.
I think if you're a fan of Claremont's X-Men, this is a complete no-brainer for you. But anyway, check it out. It's a great run. I feel like we could go another 8 hours easily on this topic.
Oh yeah, we could go 8 hours on like just a handful of issues. Like,
we'll start that up.
Yeah, like I could just sit here going like Starfinger for like hours.
Mordu always was the one who was more puzzling to me, but let's do it.
Oh my God, Mordu's whole thing where like his weakness is if you bury him alive, he loses his powers.
Yeah, it's kind of dark, right? I mean,
it's really dark. And then when Chameleon Boy gets possessed by that crystal from Mordru to kill Superboy figures out, oh, the way I stop him is by burying Chameleon Boy alive.
Yeah. It's
I
good
think
stuff, kid. You want it.
I think that was a Carrie Bates story. But yeah, it's you know, have at it. You know, go read it, have fun, enjoy comics, enjoy fun comics. We didn't even get to talk that much about like the individual Legionnaires, like Mon-El. And
yeah, maybe what we should do, maybe we should dive into the characters and the villains just as a feature before we get to this promised retrospective of something we both despise.
Yeah, no, we should probably do some more positive stuff because we're gonna eat up all our goodwill.
Yes,
it's gonna be a real shame. But
it is a shame. I look forward to losing all the subscribers. It'll be a good time.
Excellent.
All right, well, Joe, thank you very much, and we will talk again very soon.
Sounds good. Thank you.